My name is Abraham Lincoln, and I was born in a log cabin. Everybody knows that. But what does that mean? A log cabin? You hear that it was out on the frontier. Actually, it was out on the frontier. It was next to the wilderness. For those who live in the city, what do those words mean? Wilderness is where there's wild animals and trees, no humans. The frontier is kind of what it sounds like, out front, the frontier. Civilization has traveled that far and stopped. That's where my father decided to have a farm, out on the frontier of Kentucky. Back then, when they traveled around trying to find new lands to populate or to farm, they always thought that if the land had trees on it so thick that you couldn't see the sun shining through, that must be fertile land. And if the land just had grass like in the plains, well, if trees aren't growing there, it's probably not very fertile. So their idea was to find the thickest darn forest and plant yourself right down there. But what did you have to do? You had to clear the trees out, didn't you? And when I was 8 or 9 years old, my father put an axe in my hand, and it pretty much never left my hand since. My father taught me how to work real hard, but he didn't teach me how to love it. Now, out on the frontier, so I would think that probably some of the things that I did as a young boy growing up out on the frontier might be like what you go through every day. Like you get up before dawn, right before the sun comes up, and you go out and feed the cow and gather chicken eggs and some firewood to warm the house up, right? Don't you do that in the morning? And if the horse happens to get out of the corral, you got to run out and catch him somewhere, right? Doesn't everybody do that here? Well, that's what we had to do. But our cabin still, I would think, had some conveniences that you have. Like our cabin had wall-to-wall flooring. You have that in your house. What do you think my wall-to-wall flooring was? Holler it out. Dirt, that's what it was. We had dirt on the floor. And we also had direct lighting, you could say. We had candles. We had indirect lighting. We had a window. But we also had central heating. We had the fireplace right in the middle of the cabin. But one thing we do share is we had the state-of-the-art entertainment center back in that cabin, like you have in your living room. Our state-of-the-art entertainment center happened to have been a bookshelf. And out on the frontier, when you're traveling across no roads, you couldn't carry much. But one thing that I would think every settler had carried in that wagon was a book. Maybe only one book. And that had to go with them. Even if Ma and Pa didn't know how to read and write, like my parents didn't know how to read and write. But that one book that was in that wagon was the Bible, wasn't it? That was the first book that I learned the passages from. That was the first book that I learned how to read. My mother, who didn't know how to read and write, she had been taught many of the passages from her parents, and she had memorized them. And we would sit around the fire at night, and she would repeat those stories to my older sister and I. And that's how we picked them up. And that started off my journey of wanting to know more, wanting to learn how to read and write myself. Well, backing up a little bit, being born in a cabin out in the wilderness, February 12th, 1809, that was kind of a long time ago, wasn't it? Okay, if you can't comprehend that, that means I'm over 205 years old. That's old, isn't it? And you know what? I don't feel a day over 150. Well, when I was born out there, that blistery, wintry night, from what I understand, I don't remember, My mother was there, my father was there, my older sister, she was only 2 years old, she was there. And also I had an aunt and an uncle and a cousin there. You pretty much, when things like this happen, big events, you kind of get the whole family together. And a lot of times families would travel together out to the frontier for safety, just for security. Because you know what happens to a banana when it leaves the bunch, right? It gets skinned. So out there in the frontier, you want to be protected. So they were there also for this birth. And my father already had a daughter, so I kind of have an idea he wanted a son. So then when I came out and got cleaned up a little bit, he picked me up in his arms and he raised me up and had a big smile on his face. And then he handed him to my cousin Dennis. He was like 9 years old. He presented him to him. And Dennis took a look at me. He wasn't too sure. He handed him back to my dad and said, "Here, you take him. He's not going to amount to much." But as I grew up, got a little older, the idea of learning reading and writing was stronger and stronger. My father really didn't care for it. What good is learning how to read and write when all you're needed for is to clear land, plant seeds, harvest products, take care of the animals? There's no time for reading and writing. But my mother, she knew. She knew that that's where the future was be for my sister and I. So she pushed us on. So then, eventually, as I got older, we did go to school. Now, there was no school in town because there was no town. Out there in the frontier, you had farms every so often, a mile down the holler this way and a mile down the holler that way. Well, eventually, as I got older, and the more I worked for my father, the better I got at it, the more he farmed me out to the neighbors to go work for the neighbor all day long and split his rails or help him with his harvest, and I'd get paid a couple of pennies or something like that, or maybe a ham or something like that. But when I got home, it was my duty as a son to give it all to my father to help with the family. Well, I realized from doing that for a few years that I didn't want to be a farmer anymore. And the way out of that was to stick my face into a book. And the more I read, the more I wanted to read. I kept finding books here and there from different people in the community. And as we moved and the communities got bigger and bigger, then I would have access to more and more books. And you know, let's say if you're out on the frontier and you head back east, you knew you were getting to a bigger town than where you came from because the cabins weren't as many as it was before. They were starting to turn into maybe a brick building, or they were turned into a clapboard building to where the boards were finished on all four sides and it wasn't round logs. You knew that, we're getting closer to town. And in that town, there was probably a mill that could mill that lumber. So you knew you were getting closer to town. And I knew that I was getting closer to different books. Now, when I was young, I read books that you could find in your library right now in your school. I read books like Aesop's Fables, Arabian Nights, Pilgrim's Progress, Shakespeare, To Be or Not to Be. And I still don't know what that means. But I read books like that. And you could find those in your library today. The thing about those books is, those books plus the Bible, they taught me lessons. They told me how to live my life, that good triumphs over evil, that there's a moral to the story that I can apply to my life. It tells me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And as I got older, I realized that I wanted to help my fellow man. I had a desire that I wanted to see this country improve. I wanted to see my community improve. And I had that desire when I kept moving, and as I got older as a young adult, my jobs would reflect that. You probably heard that at one time I was a clerk in a grocery store or a general store. Well, there I could help customers. And then I was at the post office. I would help deliver mail. And someone would come in and say, I don't know how to write, but I want to send a letter back east to my cousin. Can you help me with that? So I'd help them write their letters. And then I was a surveyor. That means that I would go out in the wilderness or out in the frontier, and I would help mark lines to tell where people's land started and stopped. We had moved as a young boy many times because my father would buy land that somebody had already owned. And they would come back later and say, hey, this is my land that you're on, because he couldn't read and write. So we kept moving. So then I would help someone who couldn't read and write. I would help them decide where their property was that they were buying or that they owned. So I was a surveyor. And then I became a lawyer. I know some think that's too bad, but anyway, I became a lawyer because then I could help the average person with, let's say they had a debt to collect, or someone accidentally stole or shot their horse or stole their cow or something like that. I can help them as a lawyer. And then I realized as President of the United States, I could help the whole country. I could help the small person all the way up to the whole country to improve. And one of those things that I kind of liked for the improvements that I saw was that growing up, we always traveled down rivers. You could travel up a river, it's kind of tough, but we traveled down rivers. Down in New Orleans, I traveled a couple times on a flatboat. And I realized that you can only take produce and products where the river goes, and that's downriver. So there had to be a better way to do things. So what I realized growing up in Kentucky and everything back east was that the railroads was the future of the United States at that time. So I will leave you with this. So how do you get from a log cabin to the White House? Well, you live and try to do your best. Do your best. Always learning, always reading. Remember that good does triumph evil. Strive for what is right for your fellow man and your country. Believe in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of these United States. That's what I did during the horrendous Civil War. That's what guided me on my decisions. So that we may be a free and prosperous people in a free and prosperous land. Thank you very much.